Greetings, everyone. Welcome to this International Law Association of Canada event. We're having a wide-ranging armchair discussion on international law practice with Alan H. Kessel, former legal advisor to the Department of Global Affairs. My name's Oonagh Fitzgerald. I'm president of the International Law Association of Canada, ILA Canada, and a senior fellow with the Human Rights Research and Education Centre at the University of Ottawa. I had the pleasure of moderating this interview. In keeping with Indigenous protocol and building respectful relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples of Canada, let me begin by acknowledging the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples. We are meeting virtually across Canada and beyond, so I would like to acknowledge that the Indigenous peoples are the original occupiers, traditional stewards, and inherent protectors of the lands and waters called Canada today. Nous sommes reconnaissants de vivre, d'apprendre de cette terre et d'en profiter, et nous nous engageons à la décolonisation dans nos vies personnelles, nos entreprises, nos organisations, nos écoles et dans nos communautés. Les engagements que nous prenons dans cette reconnaissance des terres doivent être activement poursuivis et s'accompagnent de la conviction que la décolonisation commence par la réconciliation avec tous les peuples autochtones, y compris les Premières Nations, les Inuits et les Métis. Pour que la réconciliation soit couronnée de succès, nous devons continuer d'approfondir les façons dont nous écoutons les peuples autochtones en tirant des leçons et les soutenant en ce qui concerne leur résilience, leur résistance et leur autodétermination. The International Law Association of Canada is the Canadian branch of the International Law Association based in London, England, and founded in Brussels, Belgium in 1873. With over 4,500 members worldwide, our collective objective is to promote the study, clarification, and development of international law, both public and private, and the furtherance of international understanding and respect for international law. Our membership is global and diverse, and our members provide a full range of international law services to the states and non-state actors that shape our current socioeconomic, environmental, and political context. Comprised of legal scholars, legal practitioners, students, and policymakers, the ILA Global Network and its regional and national branches contribute to the work of ILA research committees on important topics of international law. They also hold biennial conferences. The last one was in Athens, Greece in June, and the next one is in Vienna, Austria in 2026. The ILA organizes panels and workshops on a wide range of international law topics, such as this one on international law practice. I will now introduce ILA Canada's special guest, Alan Kessel. Alan was Assistant Deputy Minister, Legal Affairs and Legal Advisor to Global Affairs Canada between September 2017 and May 2024. Prior to his appointment, he was Deputy High Commissioner in London between September 2013 and August 2017. He held numerous positions in the legal branch of Global Affairs Canada, including that of the Legal Advisor, 2005 to 2013, as Deputy Legal Advisor and Director General of the Bureau of Legal Affairs, 2004 to 2005, as Director of the United Nations Criminal and Treaty Law Division. His postings abroad include the Canadian Embassy in Sweden, the Canadian Mission to the United Nations in Geneva, Switzerland, and the Canadian High Commission in London, United Kingdom. Alan Kessel a passé une grande partie de sa carrière à négocier des instruments bilatéraux et multilatéraux allant des traités d'extradition à la mise en place de systèmes de justice pénale internationaux pour poursuivre les auteurs de crimes de guerre, de crimes contre l'humanité et de génocide. Il a représenté les intérêts canadiens devant les organismes des Nations Unies et a présenté les points de vue du gouvernement devant les comités parlementaires canadiens. Son travail juridique sur les questions arctiques comprenait la délimitation, excusez-moi, du plateau continental du Canada et les questions de souveraineté dans le Grand Nord. Alan received a Bachelor of Arts degree in 1976 from the University of Waterloo and a Bachelor of Laws degree in 1979 from Osgoode Hall Law School in Toronto. He was called to the Bar of Ontario in 1981, and after working in private practice in Toronto, he joined the Department of External Affairs and International Trade in 1983. So welcome, Alan. And before we begin the interview, we would like to encourage participants to pose questions in the Q&A function, and we'll do our best to address your questions throughout the session. Veuillez poser vos questions en anglais ou en français. Thank you. And one opening caveat I would make for Alan is that as he's a retiring federal public servant and lawyer, Alan will not be able to discuss or disclose information that is solicitor-client privileged or subject to the Official Secrets Act. So just bear that in mind. But with that, we have many, many questions, and we're going to go really until we've exhausted Alan, and we'll do the best we can anyway. So as I say, welcome, Alan. And why don't we start with your early career? I've given people a sort of a survey of everything, but how did you begin your career in law, and what motivated you to become a lawyer?
Well, yeah, that's a really good question. First of all, thank you, Oonagh. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for being here. And also hi to everybody out there, and really looking forward to this discussion. I would point out my background is actually from Muskoka. It's a beautiful area of Ontario. For those who don't know, the Muskoka region and the lakes up there. And it's just a little way of projecting a bit of our incredible scenery in this country. Well, that's it's a simple question with a very complex response. What motivates people to do things? Some people fall into careers. Other people spend their lives trying to figure out what they want to do. I knew very early on that was what was driving me was a sense of right and wrong. I'm a child of a refugee from Nazi Germany who left Germany to get away from Hitler with his parents, lost a lot of our family in the process, but who constantly reminded me as a young child and also through my adolescence that we were very lucky to have survived that incredibly difficult period, which resulted in the Holocaust. And so I grew up with a very important sense of that there's right and wrong in the world, and there actually is evil and there's good. And people have a choice. And my choice was to try and propel the good part. Now, as humans, we do have aspirations, and we all are susceptible to wishful thinking about how wonderful we are. But clearly, when you're going through your adolescence and trying to figure out what do you want to do after high school, it's a tough place to be. So I did an undergrad, as you said, at Waterloo. My dad was a prof at Waterloo teaching engineering. I failed miserably at math and science. And because I was such a failure, there was no way I was going to go into anything that resembled that. But what did interest me was diplomacy and law. And so after my undergrad, I applied to law school, was very lucky to get into Osgoode, and did my undergrad, my law degree at Osgoode. I think just something to mention to younger students who are going through something like this, there was this kind of massive impetus that you ended up in Bay Street after you got out of law school, because it was really law schools in the 70s was driving you towards business. There was very few who were kind of the hippie types who were off doing clinics and would be doing much more socially activist law. But there was no such thing as teaching about human rights. There was no such thing as international law. There was conflicts. And so the real thrust and parry of the law was about commerce. And I found myself at Bay and Queen in a very small law firm doing corporate commercial law, which involved incorporating companies to buy up Southern Ontario farmland for very wealthy Germans. And one day I found myself lying on my sofa in Toronto at Davisville and thinking, I can't get up in the morning to go and do that stuff. This is just total shit. And I thought, what do I want to do? So part of that was a bit of risk taking and saying, I'm going to just do something completely different and go into, see if I can get into government and particularly diplomacy, not thinking that would be the avenue because nobody was talking to me about that as an avenue for law. I thought I'd just end up using my law as a kind of a guiding principle. And the crazy thing was, the minute I got into global affairs, which is now global affairs, external affairs at the time, foreign affairs in between, they threw me straight into law. And I found a world that I didn't know existed. So risk, serendipity, a desire, listening to your gut about not staying in the place where you didn't want to be, thrust me to a place I'd never heard of or knew of. And I would just say to the younger folks who are looking to completely plot out their careers, maybe just listen to your gut sometime and do the thing that makes sense to you, because there is no perfect plan. I didn't have a perfect plan. I ended up doing what I was doing through a need to find something that meant something. It's a long-winded way of saying how I got here, but it's actually crucial as a foundation stone for where I ended up, and we can discuss that too.
So you didn't have a chance to study international law at Osgoode. You mentioned to me that you had had a course with Louise Arbour, and she was probably teaching something like criminal law, yeah. But then I guess your paths crossed later again when she was a
well, she wasn't doing international law. I mean, and at that point there was almost no one. She was my criminal prof. Mm-hmm. And then John Sapinko was another guy who was to be on the Supreme Court. There were two parts to the criminal procedure, and looking at the time as a student sitting here before these folks, you're just waiting for the lecture to end. But looking back, I realized I had some of these incredible, monumental brains that if I was only smart enough, I would have appreciated them more. Now, I did run into Louise Arbour later in my career when she came looking for money for international courts to build in Rwanda and with respect to Yugoslavia. I was going to ask her why she gave me that lousy mark in criminal, but the reality was she probably didn't remember me from then, but she certainly remembered me from that meeting on the money. So because she actually got money.
Yeah, no, that's good. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about being a legal advisor at Global Affairs. What were your first impressions and early experiences? It sounds like you were kind of almost ill-prepared to be there. Was there a particular file you worked on that was formative in shaping the advisor you became?
So I'll say something else to people who worry about going into new jobs is you'll never be prepared for the job. It's just a fact of life. If you are so arrogant to think you will be, then I probably wouldn't have hired you. But I went in not really knowing what it was, and for good reason. Who had ever experienced that? The very interesting thing was that the first file I got in the legal bureau when I got there in the legal branch was the downing of Korean Airlines 007 over the Kamchatka Peninsula by the Soviets, who shot down that 747, on which there was at least one Canadian. And I was just handed the file and told, please put together a claim against the Soviet Union. Well, who knew anything about claims? Who knew aviation law? Who knew how do you deal with these things? But I had a toolkit, which is the toolkit we all leave law school with. And you only really realize the discipline you have after leaving law school, as that law school is really about a discipline, how to think and how to approach problems, as opposed to knowing everything. So just be rest assured, those of you who are starting in a career, that if you've actually got your toolkit, you will deal with those crazy things. So formative, yes. And I'd say the interesting symmetry of it is that the last file that I was dealing with in May, and is continuing, was the downing of PS 752, Ukrainian Airlines, over Tehran by the Iranians. And there's a kind of a crazy bookend quality to starting a career 41 years earlier, dealing with the downing of an international aircraft, and then ending your career with the ongoing file of another downing of an aircraft, which was incredibly difficult. So formative, yes, but it was only the beginning, because working in a foreign ministry legal office, it's really like peeling an onion. You can cry every time you find another layer, but it goes on and on and on, and there is a new layer every day. So there are a number of cases.
You've spoken to me before about how you enjoy the interface between policy and law, and that's always, it's one of the challenging and interesting aspects of practicing in the government. But tell me a little bit about how you deal with those issues of policy and law together and manage that.
Well, actually, it's a three-cornered hat, and some of the folks who've heard me talk about this, it's really the three-cornered hat of policy, politics, and law. Because as a lawyer for government, you have to provide basically legal advice to whomever is in government. Your job is to provide clear and cogent legal advice to whichever party is in, whether they be conservative or liberal. Certainly in the federal government, I've only worked under liberal and conservative, but it would be for any government that we're in, were it to be NDP or the like. And any government lawyer is committed to providing the best legal advice, no matter what party is in power. However, that's very crisp and clear. The reality is, when you come to your client and they look at you when you've made some suggestions and you haven't taken into account either the political nature of what it is, or the policy of their party platform, or of their commitments, whether good, bad, or indifferent, then you kind of lose credibility. So a good lawyer in government comes with the capacity to look at all of that scope of the policy, the politics, and then provide a spectrum of risk management to the client to say, all of this within the box is legal. Outside of this box, it's not legal. And within this box, there is a risk management, escalator from 10 to 90%. And we need you to tell us where you're comfortable with whatever the risk it is you want to take to do this. But our job is also to show them the risks and the benefits of what they want. So without being too pointed, certain governments, well, maybe every government that comes in, assumes that the public service really was in the pocket of the previous government. And there's a kind of a suspicion and hesitancy to kind of believe what the public service is saying. And so we found that whether they be liberal or conservative, they would come in, and it took a period of a good 3 to 6 months before there would be a level of trust built up. But the trust comes with you immediately saying, we recognize what you're here for, we recognize what you ran on, and we recognize where you want to go with your policy. We're here to help you ensure that it's done within a legal framework.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about how law fits with diplomacy. Do you sometimes find that there's a conflict between kind of black letter concepts and diplomatic exigencies? It's maybe a bit like this political question. And do you think international law is amenable to ambivalence and shadings?
Well, like every question you've asked so far, I do have to go back a little bit, and this is to antiquity. Now, diplomacy came out of the realization that if the other side sent a messenger with a message you didn't like, and because you didn't like it, you killed the messenger, then it kind of cut back on the capacity to interact. Not only that, but no one wants to be a messenger. And so what came out of that, including Machiavelli and his really interesting book on how to engage, was that, and the Persians came up with this first, was to say, we will give a special coverage to those messengers. They will wear a cloak of immunity. And the immunity is to allow them to express freely and without fear the wishes, the desires, and the options that their client, their king, their prince, as in Machiavelli, their prince is putting forward to the other prince. And usually this was in the situation of conflict. And so out of that situation of conflict and the desire to at least have a capacity to communicate, they created this cadre of messengers who were the original diplomats, because they then became the untouchables who communicated between the princes and the like, no matter where they were. And this exists to this day. So, and this, we can get into the discussion on diplomatic immunity, because people think of it as some kind of weirdness, that why should these people have it? And they just sort of abuse it and can abuse it. The reality, it came out of a need, a political need, and a policy need to have an avenue for discussion. You'll see today that we've gone beyond that, so that the United Nations, which has the capacity to talk with each other, all of those diplomats within that system are immune. And we can talk about how immune, because there's immunity and there's immunity, but they are safe to use the language they need to use and do the things they need to do in order to accomplish the requirements of their sovereign or their prince. So you asked whether there's some nuances there. Remember, even if you're a private sector lawyer, or you're an academic lawyer, you're looking at the nuances in any situation. I mean, part of the training we get in law school, yes, it's to write as clearly as possible so that there is no confusion. And yet, for every very clear sentence and very clear issue, there are probably as many interpretations as there are lawyers in the room looking at them. And that's not a negative. It's really about saying, how can we interpret what that was deemed to have been when the legislators wrote that down? And whether there is a capacity to read into that word, the capacity to nuance and use them to the benefit of either side. And that's what we're trained to do. So when we negotiate treaties, for instance, we're very careful with our language, but we're also careful to sometimes put in enough wiggle room in language that we can then use as either escape hatches in the future, or to use as a way to expand the intention of the drafters at the time. But that we can delve into that further if you wish.
Thank you. That's a great discussion of constructive ambiguity, right? We can talk more about it, because I think we'll get to another question about what makes a good treaty, but that's really a great start on it. Okay, so I think I'm going to turn now to some questions about work conditions and relations, since you've spent a long career in the public service. And over the years, there have been instances of staff at external, foreign, global affairs over the years expressing discontent through unions and whistleblowers about the conditions of work and the governing party at different epochs, like you say, whether, which government is each stripe, there have been issues. And there have been these the discontent about the conditions of work, and that the governing party doesn't value or understand the contribution that diplomats can bring. And you've been a manager, obviously a senior manager. You've also been a young diplomat and lawyer. So you must have seen some of these kind of expressions of dissatisfaction over the years. And I'm just wondering, when you reflect back on this, what's your impression and observations? Are these fair comments, or is it just that, you know, overflow of tension because of the different roles that diplomats have to play with governments, like what you've been talking about already, right? The challenge of representing a new government.
Well, when you say conditions of work, you know, those are words that can be interpreted in many ways.
Sure.
You know, there are unions in the public service in order to represent employees to the employer, and that is, like in any institution or in any place, part of what the unions do. And there's always an attempt by employees to improve their level of either pay, whether it means to catch up in equal pay or equal pay for work of equal value, and a number of things. There's also a question within in a foreign ministry as to how do you equalize the value of your salary when you're living in another country, which has a different cost of living. And so over the years, part of the major discussions of the unions with the federal government have been, how do you ensure that people who do work in these fields overseas, and I have had 4 postings because I'm a diplomat that happens to be a lawyer, not a lawyer that happens to be a diplomat. And that's the difference between ourselves and the Department of Justice, is that the lawyers that I was with are foreign service lawyers, foreign service international lawyers, and we were posted. But that has a massive impact, not only on the employee, but on the employee's family. Remember, you have a spouse, and then you'll have children. And in a world where you needed 2 incomes to raise kids, and your spouse goes to a country where there is no capacity to work, or it's not impossible to work because you're in a country like a China or somewhere else, or you're in a place where there is no agreement to work. And even if you could have an agreement to work, the risks of being in a private situation in a country that has different laws would make it difficult for the spouse to work. So many of the discussions that unions have been around conditions of work. How do you bring some equality? How do you ensure that spouses can feel that they are part of this endeavor? Because I'll tell you quite frankly, none of us managed to survive without having a spouse who supported us and children who were willing to do the kind of thing. And the country wouldn't have the kind of spectrum of diplomats that you needed if everybody said, well, no, I'm not going to do it because I can't, my wife doesn't have a job and my kids can't go to the school they need to go to. So many of the discussions internally about conditions are really about, how does my family fit into this? And that's what a lot of folks in Canada and abroad don't actually see. They just see us and they say, oh yeah, you're wandering around with a martini in your hand going to a cocktail party. Isn't that a great life? Well, actually, you have your 24/7 when you're on, and then you also have to run kids to school and do gymnastics, hockey practice, dance, and hopefully have a wife or spouse, as it is today, whether you're male or female, is to find that special space where they can feel good about what they're doing. So yeah, there are conflicts and demands. Fortunately, we've had, understanding Treasury Board or understanding others who've allowed us to do that. Are conditions becoming more difficult? Yes. I think the world's a much less safe place. And when you take your family into a very difficult zone, you want to know that the government is there to get you out of it if you need to, but also to put them up and also to ensure that the kids are taken care of so that you can go on doing your job, which is to represent the country, but also to be reporting on these key issues to allow the politicians to make decisions. All of this is going on behind the scenes. I mean, it's like an iceberg. You're only seeing the top 1/8, which is, us doing our thing. But it's
And I guess
about
every new government has to familiarize itself with all those circumstances.
they do, and they're very surprised every time. It's almost like, getting on a bike every time a new government comes in. It's great before they head out because they've lived through this process. And I think part of the public service's job is when, the new politicians come in, is to bring them up to speed on not only the key crises of the day and the things that we're doing, but also the responsibility they have to be running a ministry, a department. And especially when you get new ministers in who've never done that, if they've never been junior ministers, they've never been parliamentary secretaries, it's a really tough slog. But you just have to have the kind of resilience to do it. And we have managed. And I think by 6 months to a year, you start to get the kind of aha moments in new ministers who look at you and go, oh my God, it's just that, I was just in Egypt, or I was just over in one of these other posts which are difficult. I was in Kinshasa, I was wherever, and my God, I didn't believe what it takes to just get from one place to another, let alone have the meetings, be secure, ensure that everybody's there. And you know what? They become our best supporters by the time they leave. Then they leave. Then we have to deal with the next crowd.
That's the nature of democracy.
Okay,
so
pesky democracy. Yeah.
I have a question about the process of getting, the all of government position on legal questions. So we first met, I think, when I was either at Department of Justice or at Privy Council office, or maybe it was when I was in National Defense. But, there's always this issue of how do we get the views, the support of the Judge Advocate General's office on military questions that touch on other questions that affect foreign affairs and jurisdiction that justice is concerned about. What's your sense of how we solve those problems? Most of the time a lot of times we're allies. I mean, we can have conflicts, but we're allies in trying to convey some important principles of international law and related domestic law, perhaps. But tell me a little bit about that process and, what your thoughts are on it. It can be very time consuming and it can be stressful at times.
It can be very stressful, but I think we all go back to what is the mandate of your minister, and what is the either legislation say, or what does the mandate letter provided by the Prime Minister to your ministers say, in which case you're all coming with a bit of a playbook. So there's the National Defense Act, there's the Foreign Affairs Act, there's the Justice Department, the Justice Ministers' key responsibilities for the administration of justice. There's also the letters that are put together by Privy Council office, our Cabinet office in Canada, and those letters are a representation of what the Prime Minister and Cabinet want to see the ministers do. So you do have a roadmap. It's not just like you come into the room and say, I'd like this, I'd like that. You come into a room with clear interests that have been articulated, either in legislation or policy or a letter, or are dealing with a particular issue. So for example, so I'll just give you an example, which is like every day coming into the office was like an exam question at law school. I'd come in whatever time in the morning, 8:30, and I'd find that there's a message there, urgent, of course, everything's urgent. And it says, this is in from the JAG, which is the Judge Advocate General over at DND. One of the Canadian frigates is in international waters out just off the coast of Egypt. They have noticed that there is a dhow with some characters on it, how to distinguish who they are, but there's no flag on the vessel. This is an unflagged vessel. It appears that there are weapons. We are heading off in the direction of another space, but we've come across these folks. What do we do? So that's your example, discuss.
Yeah, discuss. Have a
Like
meeting with council and discuss.
it's like, yeah, that's when you're sitting in your exam at law school and, discuss for the next 3 hours. But you don't have 3 hours because nobody has 3 hours anymore. Maybe we had 3 hours back in the 70s and 80s, but we don't have 3 hours. If they have a half an hour, we've got these guys in front of us. What do we do? How do we action this? We've now come across this potential, we don't know if they're terrorists. We don't know if they're smugglers. What is our duty of care? What do we do? So by definition, the first thing you do is you get together the folks who would have an interest. Clearly it came from the Department of National Defense. Clearly there was a question as to armed individuals on a vessel. Where we need to get our maritime specialty folks in there because you've got a vessel without a flag. What is the law pertaining to vessels without flags? Where is the vessel? As I mentioned to you, it was just outside the territorial sea of Egypt, but it's in international waters or whatever. It would be different if it was in the territorial sea, because at that point you're running into a question about sovereignty but it could be in the EEZ, the economic in the economic zone. What does that mean? Is there a difference? By the way, do we have a duty to? These guys look like they could be dangerous. Do we have a duty to stop them? Should we be boarding? What does boarding mean? How do we board? If we board, which law applies? Do we then run into a problem with our charter and the Canadian Constitution? If we touch that vessel, is there some Canadian ownership to that thing?
If we detain them,
sorry.
If we detain them,
exactly. If we detain them, but by definition, if you stop anything or you bring them onto you, if you take their guns away, or if you shoot something across the bow, and then we deal with this in the piracy context too. Of Somalia, we had those very difficult questions. What do you do once you touch these people? They suddenly become yours, and they're in your vessel asking for 120 channels on the TV and the brig, and you don't want that. Or they have a right domestically to question that law. So the long answer to your very short and quasi-simple question is that you have to get these great minds together. You really have to have a bunch of experts who know everything from, the application of international humanitarian law, because this may be a conflict that's going on, you don't know. What about the maritime boundaries issue? What about the sovereignty of states with respect to the Law of Sea Convention? What about the domestic law that applies possibly within a context overseas, although the Supreme Court has tried to be very careful about not applying domestic Canadian law overseas? And we can get into that discussion vis-a-vis Afghanistan at one point. But at the end of your half hour, you've got a bunch of, staff in the minister's office jumping up and down saying, why can't you tell us what to do? So that's your exam question. I'm not going to give you the answer to this exam question because we actually had one situation, and I'm not telling you what we did, but it worked out. But all of those particular issues, whether it meant nudging gently that vessel into Egyptian waters, such that the Egyptians suddenly took notice and dealt with these guys, or whether you determined that they were smuggling people and these people's lives were at risk. If you did anything, they would just abandon the vessel and drown the migrants. You'd have to deal with those too. And then you may need to get some political authority for what you wanted to do. And you have to do this all within that very short period of time. So you need a really smart minister who's been briefed. You need people who say, oh, no, well, it can't just be the minister because, we really need to have the PM involved in this thing. But the PM is traveling in the air somewhere to some place. So it's about that entire coordination. Then it's not just legal. So then you have to get in the geographic folks who say, hang on a minute, you could cause an international incident because there's this very delicate balance between, the Egyptians and the Sudanese and the blind and whatever, and you shouldn't be doing any of this thing, and we want you to stop. And that's when you realize that this is a delectable multicolored coat that you need to work your way through. Yeah. What you do need, and what you just said, is a kind of common understanding that we need to provide the best advice to government to allow the politicians to make an informed decision on that particular issue. And that's what we did every day of the week, multiple times a day.
So I'm going to ask you about some of the history making and less obvious files that you may have touched on. And I've kind of got them in a few buckets. One, I want to talk a little bit about peace and security, which kind of flows nicely from the example you gave. I'm just wondering, UN institutions, how do you think they're holding up? We've had this problem with UN Security Council vetoes for many years, it seems, and there's a rising role of the UN General Assembly, the role of the International Court of Justice. When we talked, we were thinking about how everyone thought after 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, that we'd somehow achieved the end of history, and this was the victory of capitalism and liberal democracy. But it's actually been quite a tumultuous period, hasn't it? So tell me a little bit about your thoughts of what happened after 1989.
And all of that stuff. That's just everything that people have been writing books on that are 600 pages, right? Just in 5 minutes. Okay, fine. Yeah.
I can prompt you with a question.
Well, the beauty of one of the first things we learned in communications in government was no matter what the question, you answer what you want to answer. And that's what we teach politicians too. So whenever you see them not answering the question, it's because they were told how to do that. Just going back again a little bit, because it's very interesting, another bookend, is I came into government under Trudeau the father in 1983 in September. And just before he lost the election in 84, and then Mulroney came in, and it was a different thing. But it was very interesting to see what was going on. That was the Cold War. And I was sent down as a baby diplomat to New York to work with Stephen Lewis, who was named by Mulroney to be the ambassador in New York. And so this was like, oh my God, I've never been, not only had I never been to New York, which was one thing to start with, and then this crazy multilateral weirdo conglomeration. I was assigned to what they called First Committee, which was the Disarmament Committee. And in the Cold War, it was really cold because essentially nobody spoke to each other except in set pieces. And then you were admonished if you got too close to those who you weren't supposed to speak to, which included Soviets and anybody on the East Bloc. And yet, at the same time, you were supposed to try and find a way forward. So I learned in my 5 months, whatever it was, in New York on that committee, I learned very quickly what the Cold War looked like. And it was basically stalemate on everything. Anytime the US would put up its flag to say we would like to do this, you would get a Russian flag going up, then supported by all the Soviet socialist republics, all of whom were supposed to be independent, but really weren't, with the Ukraines and the Belaruses and all of those things, in the East Bloc with the Poland and the Czechs and the Slovak, you name it. And it was kind of this phalanx of, no, we're not going to do this unless we want to do it. And then it was about how do you break down something towards something that we could all work with. And it was incredibly difficult. So when you talk about what happened with the Berlin Wall coming down in 89, it was this kind of amazing thing that just sort of almost happened overnight. It was this breakout and the collapse so quickly of the Eastern Bloc. It scared everybody, including the West, because you didn't know what to do with this. I mean, what was going to happen if all of these people just suddenly started pouring into Western Europe, which they started to do, as you may recall, out in Berlin to begin with, and then there was this mass migration into Europe. But the other thing that happened was that there was total and complete disarray within the East Bloc. They lost their center of gravity, and then they started banging into each other. And that meant that nobody could agree, but everybody felt that they didn't want to be under Soviet rule anymore. So the Czechs from 68 remember what it was like when the tanks came rolling into Prague. And the Hungarians remembered in 56 what happened. And basically, there was a complete and utter disarray, which we took advantage of. And it was very short-sighted in one thing and long-sighted in the other. The short-sighted thing was we shouldn't have been gloating. Reagan was talking about how capitalism had won and we had managed to beat this. The reality was that there were a lot of humiliated people there, including people who didn't have jobs and who had long memories. And we maybe also thought that we would have a massive dividend, which meant we didn't have to have our forces in Europe anymore. And we should take them out. This is kind of concertining a lot of things that are going on between 89 and 99. So between 89 and 99, we suddenly found a Soviet Union in disarray. We found that the satellites were looking for another center of gravity, and it turned out to be Western Europe and the States and countries like ourselves. And we started finding that we weren't alone in the room anymore. We actually could get a plurality of votes to move issues that we wanted to move. So for instance, the International Criminal Court, which people remember, was a discussion that went on and on and on forever, from post Nuremberg and Tokyo, to say we really need to have an international court that takes care of the most heinous crimes. Couldn't get anywhere until after 89, at which point...
That was the Yugoslavia too, right? That was the other impact of the fall of the wall, I guess, was the conflict in former Yugoslavia.
Well, I mean, there were good points and there were really bad points. And the Yugoslavia stuff happened in the 90s, as did the Rwanda stuff. But that was also a product of, and remember, Yugoslavia was also kind of a weirdish kind of satellite. It wasn't really Soviet Union. It was a different thing. And it was also smashed together of a conglomerate. But just to finalize this thought is that, so one of the things we really wanted was to move on the issue of an international criminal court. And we managed within that period, when the wall came down, to galvanize the international community around the concept of getting this done, so that we ended up in Rome eventually. Now, clearly the Russians, as they were at the time, and some of the other actors, such as China, and some of the folks who knew they didn't want to be on this, the Syrians and the Iraqs and the Iranians didn't want to be on this thing. They weren't, but we did manage to get it through. So 25 whatever years ago, we managed to get that done. And so we were in a euphoria thinking, wow, look what we've done. We can now just plow on ahead. And we did. We built a huge amount of human rights structures that we believed were universal in that time. The tricky part was that, yeah, we did get all that stuff. And we were massively successful on the democratic part of it, which was that, every state got a vote. But what we didn't think of, plan, be aware of, was that there could be a boomerang effect. And what we're seeing now within the international institutions, post Putin coming into power, and we should have read his book, just like we should have read Mein Kampf, because Hitler said exactly what he was going to do. And Putin said exactly what he was going to do. And we know exactly where they want to go with this thing. Just like we read Hamas's charter, we know exactly what they're going to do. Putin said he was going to reconstruct the Soviet Union no matter what. And remember, Putin was the senior KGB official in East Germany when the wall came down. So he spoke perfect East German. And part of his massive failure in life was that this thing happened on his watch, partly. Was also on the watch of others, Gorbachev and all of that. But that's what drives this move back to the old sense of history, which of course we in the West didn't understand the humiliation they went through, and therefore we were to blame for their humiliation. The fact that we believed that most Russians would want to have a democratic government, that women were to be treated equally, that the courts were not to be managed by the political level, that there not be a death penalty. We thought those were universal and that we were doing the right thing. Little did we know that there were some people who don't think they're universal. So we're in a period of revisionist history, but it's not only coming from Eastern Europe, it's coming from Africa, it's coming from Latin America, certainly coming from Asia, when you look at what China is doing and the role that China is now playing in multilateral institutions. So
back to the question about the state of UN institutions, do you think that the peremptory norm of prohibiting, use of force is being whittled away by all these different characters, or has it changed since then? Or since since the war on terror, is that part of it? Part of the change of, are some of the institutional underpinnings of the UN Charter seem like they have become weak over the last decades?
Well, I think a number of things have happened. I think the further you get away from a cataclysmic world war that puts you at the brink of annihilation, and that generation dies off, and there's no education about what that meant, and it's too rude to say what happened, and we fail to teach our children about what holocausts are and what genocides are and what it looked like and what could happen, then you lose that fear that really bound us together, the fear that bound us together, and that created the UN in San Francisco, and that was at Yalta, and that was in that vessel off the coast of Newfoundland in 1941 with Roosevelt and Churchill talking about what we want after. And in fact, they were talking about what they wanted after the war was lost, and that the arrogance of 3, 4, 5 generations later, when the most important thing is your most recent iPhone, or the Gucci wedges you're wearing, or getting your history from TikTok, or the kind of boredom of having to listen to anybody who may have been around at that time, because God forbid history repeats itself. That's what we're living with right now. And the fear, I think that,
the UN Charter puts a huge emphasis on peaceful resolution of disputes.
Yeah.
And yet that seems sort of misunderstood by a lot of people, that this process of dispute resolution is so central.
It is central, but it requires 2 to tango, or 3 to tango, or 5 to tango. The Charter also talks about respect to boundaries and borders, and yet we have seen massive abrogation of that. Use of force, and I think the question of Article 2 and others, and the right to self-defense under 51 are major discussion points either within the ICJ or amongst academics. And it doesn't, so there's a conflict between ruling out the use of force, but also permitting the right to self-defense. And so there's that kind of counterpoint between no force, but yes force when it's self-defense. And then, of course, if you take a look at what goes on in the ICJ, or amongst the academic crowd, or even with what's going on with Putin and Ukraine and other places, is that there's never been an end to the use of force. There's only been, you can't use force except in a situation of self-defense, so that everything becomes self-defense, or will be self-defense. Sorry?
It's an expanding concept.
And absolutely, I mean, quite frankly, the Russians in Ukraine have been using that concept, and also this. I mean, remember Hitler used the issue of, the German Sudetenland and the Rhineland and others, which were to provoke a change in what the League of Nations had come up with in terms of how post World War One Germany was to be contained. But that also showed the frailty of leadership. And the frailty of leadership is what ends up in wars. Because if, Chamberlain and others in Munich had basically told Hitler, don't do that, we're coming at you, or even when he wanted to move into the Rhineland, instead of capitulating completely and giving up Czechoslovakia, or accepting that Austria suddenly became annexed, if they had stopped that early enough, that wouldn't have happened. I mean, it's the same as when we look at what happened with Russia into Ukraine. It was sort of, oh, we don't want it to escalate. Oh, we're worried about this becoming better. If we give them pop guns, the Russians could be upset. Oh, but if we gave them pellet guns, then they'd be even more upset. But if we gave them guns with bullets, there would be guess what? Each step we moved. But if we'd given them the bloody tanks and the weapons that they needed, we wouldn't be sitting here in the situation worrying about whether we, as North America, at some point, if we don't help them, really help them, we're going to have to go fight a war in Europe. And that, it's almost negligent the way the Western alliances dealt with
Probably
the
a
situation
series
with Russia.
of well-intended decisions, right? It's hard.
Well, yeah, I think there were a lot of people in foreign ministries working on obituaries for the assassinated Zelensky, instead of saying which guns can we send over there to stop him getting assassinated. And I think many of those people know who they are. But I don't think most people thought that it would last more than 3 days. And they were willing to give that up. But they only realized that later, as they saw the rapacious appetite of a Putin, and understood what would happen in the Baltics or to Poland or to others, that he wasn't going to stop. So then we get back to what I said earlier, that we gave up Lahr and Baden-Baden, and we gave up our fabulous military bases in Europe, which would have had the salutary effect of saying, we're like 30 minutes away from you, Mr. Putin.
Mm-hmm.
We gave those up as this peace dividend, which we actually didn't have a peace dividend.
A last point on peaceful resolution of disputes, and the hope that this is a way to not fight wars. We had a discussion about using judicial processes more as another form of warfare, right? It's kind of like lawfare. How do we ensure? Do you have any advice as to how the courts and the tribunals can be better used to help promote shared understanding of international law?
Well, it's very interesting you say that, because I can, given the length of my career, I can tell you there used to be like 1 or 2 every 20 years from Canada that we would be involved with. It was definitely, if it was fish, we'd get involved. And we were. And, definitely if it was a maritime boundary, we would get involved. And definitely if it was the French, we'd get involved. And then Kosovo came along. But that was in a period of like 25 years, 30 years. In the past 10 years, even less, maybe 5, I've watched us go from almost 0 cases for Canada to, when I left, we were looking at about 8 or 9. If there are folks in global affairs on this thing, they could probably give you a sense of where they are now. But I mean, things like we started going to the courts because we couldn't get what we needed either through the multilateral institutions, because they were becoming so politicized, and the courts looked at least that they weren't. Plus also, we then resorted to international treaties, which had dispute resolution mechanisms within them. And the irony is that I think the dispute resolution mechanism within some of these international treaties were really thrown in at the last minute as something that you needed to do to kind of complete the, the function. But what they did do, and for instance, in the case of Myanmar, where we're looking at a genocide case, which the Netherlands and Canada are involved with, which we pursued, together with, no, sorry, I'm thinking Syria, where Syria, with the Netherlands and Canada pursued together in a torture case. We used the torture convention as the means to get in, because the Syrians had not blocked that as a way forward. In many cases, the states, the worst behavior states, have not allowed the ICJ or anybody else access to the courts. So we've had to be creative. So in the Myanmar case, we were creative. In the Ukraine case, there was also another genocide case. I think there was very great creativity. In the case of PSM 52, which is the downing of Ukrainian airlines over Tehran, where 170 people were killed, many Canadians and Canadian residents, we used the Montreal Convention and we used the Chicago Convention, both of which have dispute resolution mechanisms. And within each of those cases, there is a requirement that you undertake some negotiation. So for our sins, we did end up talking to the Iranians, which was a very interesting experience, about how to resolve this thing. And it became very clear that there was no intention to resolve it. And when, under those mechanisms, there's futility of resolution, you can then move on to either a arbitration process, and if there's no capacity to get to arbitration, you can then move to the ICJ. And you'll see that with a number of states.
I mean, it's a good process. That seems like a good process. There's lots of opportunity to try to resolve the problem. The court plays part of that role at the end.
It is. And if you think about my very first case, where we didn't get anything from the Soviets, with the downing of Korean Airlines 007, we've also seen a militancy amongst the average Canadian or average citizen who knew nothing about international law in the past, just was sort of steamrolled over by international events, excuse me, but who now, with the advent of more aware lawyers and NGOs and law firms that want to do pro bono work in the international legal area, you will find that there's a greater awareness on the part of either victims or victims' families of the resort to international treaties and the courts, which we never saw in the past. Just never saw them. So no, one, that's good and can be good. Another thing, it gives a headache to states as to how do we resolve this, because everybody comes with their own ideas about what you should do. And you can imagine the political pressure that's put on by victims' families on ministers and others as to what the state should do. And then the minister of that state looks to, in the situation of PSM 52, Canada, Ukraine, the UK, and others who were affected by that, Sweden, for instance, we were then brought into minister's office and said, well, what are you going to do, and how can you do it, and will you do it now? And it was a very interesting educational process for political level. Is you've now embarked on if you're going to go by courts, international courts, it's a 4 to 10 year process. And this is to politicians who have a window of elections which are, less than that, and who maybe have an election coming up or have constituencies that get upset, who are trying to tell us as the international lawyers, no, we need it faster, we need it now. And we're saying, well, you can't, if you want to start this, you also have under these international conventions, you have to indicate that there's a dispute between you. So the first thing you do is you have to indicate there's a dispute. How do you establish a dispute? Well, you establish a dispute by having 20, 30, 40, 100 diplomatic notes going backwards and forwards saying, you've done this to our citizens, please acknowledge you're wrong and pay up. And then they come back, we didn't do that wrong. Those weren't your citizens. And by the way, go away. And then we go, well, sorry, yes, they were our citizens. You may not recognize dual nationality, but they are Canadian and Iranian. And yes, you are responsible. And by the way, an organ of your government shot down an aircraft. And by the way, we're not going to go away. Oh, yes, you have to go away because you haven't, so this goes on. And then you go, I think we have a dispute here. So, because you can't agree. And once you have a dispute, then you have to go to the negotiation phase. Well, we'd like to negotiate about this dispute. Well, what dispute? Well, if we need to negotiate. We've got 6 months in which we have to negotiate. This is in the text. Well, we don't have a dispute. We've offered people money. There's compensation. You're just politicizing this. Go away, Canada. So you then go back to the political level who's seeing this actually unfold, and they go, "Oh my God, this." When you told us 4 to 10 years, you weren't kidding. Said, no,
Read Bleak House to get an idea.
Just please take a look. Take a look at some of the former cases when, just take a look at Lockerbie. Take a look at a bunch of these other downings of aircraft, which you couldn't get the Libyans to agree to anything, and you didn't get any kind of case. And then eventually they came up with a hybrid kind of thing where they put the court in the Netherlands using Scottish law with these lawyers. And that, I said, all of these take. In the meantime, someone in North York or Vaughan is screaming and shouting that, you're really not doing anything, and you should have been doing more, and why aren't you doing it quickly enough? And so that puts an incredible pressure on the international lawyers providing advice within government. But then they're also confronted by these wannabes out in the private sector who say, well, we understand what the law is, and you should be doing this, this, and this. And then, of course, there's a bit of a tug and pull and push as to who should be doing what and whether that's right. And then you get yanked up to a minister's office saying, Joe Blow, lawyer from, whatever in Kitchener, says that you should be doing it this way. And we say, well, okay, let's run you through this thing. And by the way, there are 4 countries trying to do this. And by the way, the Iranians know what they're doing. So
I'm gonna move on to another example for just to cover a bit of different territory, and that is environmental issues. So there's been there have been a lot of developments in environmental law over the years of your career. And I don't know if there's anything in particular you want to mention. I know you worked on maritime boundaries, and also I guess the continental shelf delimitation is something that you've worked on. That might be something you want to touch on, or the development of ITLAS as more of as a tribunal that's giving opinions now.
Well, yet again, you've basically brought the entire world into this. Yes, on the environmental stuff, and I think I've seen throughout my career when I've worked on environmental questions, from the acid rain agreement with the Americans, which was, as you may recall, back in the 80s, was a really big thing. And we also, and very little is known about this, but Canada was way ahead on the climate change stuff back in the 80s, when we were trying to push for something called a convention for the atmosphere. And that was an attempt to say, look, we really need an overarching convention, a statute that dealt with the atmosphere, because everything related to all these other issues, whether they be ozone depletion, whether they be SOx and VOx and NOx, whether it be the CO2 issues, they all are a spoke of the entire atmosphere, because the atmosphere is one giant thing around there. You can't, it's like having a smoking section on a plane. Eventually we figured out that it doesn't work. You can't have a polluting section in the earth. We tried to do that back in the late 80s. It wasn't brought on to by either the Americans or the United Nations structure, UNEP in Nairobi. And so what we ended up doing was going to the spoke. And that ended up with, we did transboundary movement of hazardous waste, which was the Basel Convention. We did things related to the Montreal Convention, which was the dealing with the ozone layer and the hydrofluorocarbons. And believe me, when I told you I was useless at science and math, as a lawyer, you have to suddenly become aware of what on earth these various components of pollutants are, and they are all science. And so, talking about bromides and the type of bromides, the chlorofluorocarbons, and what they are, and how they affect and their lifespan, and how they rise into the atmosphere. And you need to know that because you need to develop a structure that talks about how do you phase these out. And you need a structure that allows you to find alternatives to these things, especially when you have a China and an India that didn't want to be on that, but we managed to get into the ozone thing. And then, of course, you're looking at issues related to questions of the actual climate change and the Paris Agreement, and how do we live up to our reality, and how do we live up to a reality in Canada when we live in a climate that can kill you, and we depend on hydrocarbons. And how do you live up to a commitment by one government that then is pulled back by another government? So, the Chrétien government had, Mr. Chrétien went into this meeting and he came out saying, this is what we're going to do. And we all went, oh my God, do you think of talking to us about that? And then, of course, that was the law. And then you have a Harper government that says, this is not going to happen. And then you have, another Liberal government that says, yeah, we're back at the first thing. And so you are having to adapt. But the real people on the ground in industry and other places which need to have certainty. And so they're looking to us as the international lawyers to give us certainty. So yes, that's on the environmental side. On the maritime boundary side, it's another issue about certainty, but also the Law of the Sea Convention, which was this incredible achievement, another overnight success that took 40 years. Canada was hugely influential in that with Alan Beasley and the team back in the day. And it was an interdepartmental group that put together to actually go in and deal with these very difficult issues. And we had to think way ahead. We had to think about what would it be a world like if ice melted? What is ice? Is ice land? Is ice treated as land? Ice is treated as land for the indigenous. So we had to bring ideas that were so foreign to the world that the quality, the structure of H2O, depending on the temperature, could actually change the legal framework. And we put into the Law of the Sea Convention rules which we're using now, which everyone, they see them as little sleeper bombs, because we had put in rules which refer to the treatment of ice-covered water as if you were dealing with land. And that was really to protect the indigenous interests, which are now even more important as we are noticing with global warming and the melting. Another quick thing before I get off this, which, because you could go on forever, the BB&J treaty, which was recently signed about a year ago, that was the what was it called? Biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions. Everything has an acronym. So biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions was a very, very difficult negotiation because it was dealing with the kind of open area beyond our normal areas of territorial or economic zones. And how do we divide that up and how do we deal with those things? That was signed and actually will come into force or has come into force for many countries. Many countries did not sign or ratify. One of the other things we did, and I mentioned this to you before we went on air here, was the issue of how we resolved a 4,000 kilometer boundary dispute with Denmark, Greenland, which ran from the Lincoln Sea all the way down to the Labrador Sea, and included Hans Island in the middle there, which became a really very, very difficult issue. And that was another thing, 50 years for an overnight success, which we managed to do. But that came along with at a moment when governments and foreign ministers were willing to do that sort of thing. But also you had people who were pushing within legal branches to say we can do this, and people who had engaged with Indigenous and engaged with individuals in Greenland who said, look, we can do this and we can marry all the interests. And so that's another thing about what lawyers have to do, is you have to become, aware domestically about the Indigenous interests and how that has fundamentally changed the way we deal with traditional international law work, but also domestic law. Then you need to deal with how there's a country like Denmark, which is devolving authority to Greenland and what their interests are and how they eventually will be our partner. And then find that special human interest, emotional connection that says, yes, we're dividing, but we're joining. And you'll see in our agreement with Greenland and Denmark that we took particular interest in joining the issues of how do we bring Inuit from Greenland together with Inuit from Canada, even though they've been really separated in terms of who's governed them for 400 years, and that they almost had to reintroduce themselves to each other, even though they knew of each other. Their languages have changed, their way of developing has changed, and yet there was this family need to come together. How do you do this? How do you create a boundary but not have a boundary that separates people? And we did that, and that was brought to you by your international lawyers, in global affairs and other places, and delivered what a political need was. Also, and I'll stop with this, is that we demonstrated how you could solve an international maritime boundary problem peacefully in the 21st century without ever going to war, and that it ended up being to the mutual benefit of all the peoples. And that is one of the biggest things.
Write a book about that, because we do need more examples of peaceful resolution.
I think some people have tried to write a book. I mean, they mainly talk about the whiskey wars, where we used to kind of bring a bottle of, Canadian Club, and they used to bring a bottle of Gammeldansk and put it on there, or some undrinkable Danish liquor, which at the end of our negotiation, we presented them with a bottle of really good Canadian whiskey, and they gave me this undrinkable stuff, and they insisted that we'd be happy about that. But anyway, the happy part was that we solved the issue, and it's great.
I'm seeing there's quite a few questions now in the chat, so that's good. I'm going to start pulling them into the discussion, but just before I do that, I think it would make sense just to cover a little bit on the economic side, because I know you've been quite involved on some economic issues. But one thing I was going to ask you about in particular, just because you spent so much time in Britain during that period when they were voting for and then experiencing the joys of Brexiting. What are your thoughts about Brexit and international law? I give a little plug for earlier work I did, where we wrote a book called Complexities Embrace, the International Law Implications of Brexit, because it was just like a lawyer's dream for problems, but every area.
Well, so fortunately, I don't report to a deputy minister anymore, or a minister, but I can say that I think it was felt by both parties, both color of parties, whether it be conservative or liberal, that Brexit was certainly not in Canada's interest. Remember, we had spent a lot of capital working on a Canada-Europe free trade agreement. And a lot of the negotiation had been about what the Brits wanted. And as everything with the Brits, it always comes down to cheese being the last thing on the agenda. And we managed in those negotiations to do what we needed to do to open up the European market, which included 67 million Brits and their cheese, to the 40 million Canadians. So we had 500 million person market was now open to the 40 million Canadians, and we thought that this was absolutely an incredible achievement. Even though if you talk to some Canadians, they can't understand that they've now been given the opportunity to go into a 500 million population before they had to go into each little one and negotiate. They still complain. However, that's what we had to deal with. The reality then came was with Brexit, the major component of the negotiation, which was dealing with the UK, because we were heavily dependent on the UK as an entry point into Europe. Then what do you do? So our view as whatever government was that Brexit was not a good thing for Canada. But also we wanted to say to them, Brexit's not a good thing for you. And so part of our very interesting foreign policy approach was to say, let's do the math here. What do you think you're getting out of this, and why are you doing this? We showed them that there was a net negative to them doing the Brexit thing. We showed them whether their factories were running for, they ran for 2 days for the UK and 5 days for the rest of the world. So or at least 3 days or 4 days for Europe, and then you're going to create all these tariff barriers, which we didn't want because we needed a way to get our product through the UK tariff-free into the EU, which is what we had set up our relationship. This was our way in. And then we had to start this all over again with somewhere else. So our object was to say to the Brits, don't do this. But the Brits were in a very crazy place politically. Cameron made a huge mistake thinking that no sensible person in the UK would want to go for Brexit because it would mean longer lineups to get to France, and your holiday home in Spain would suddenly become unavailable, and suddenly your medical costs would just disappear. Your medical capacity to use the medical systems in various countries would disappear. Normal people would not want to do this, except they weren't dealing with normal people. They were dealing with a whole bunch of other folks who couldn't give a damn about international trade. Mm-hmm. So Britain became a small island state. And what it also did was it changed the nature of how Britain interacted with Europe and how Britain interacted with the world. A Britain part of Europe was an amazing asset for us and for them. What it did was breaking up was just show the Putins and the Chinese of this world that you can start picking apart the cohesion of Europe by just, unscrewing the economic side. Now, add together with a Trump government that we were dealing with in North America, when you start dealing with how do we deal with a NAFTA that's now turned into a CUSMA? It sounds like a disease as opposed to something positive. And then how do you deal with Fortress North America versus Buy America first, which doesn't include Buy North America? So this was what my trade team, fabulous trade team, have been did during the time that I was there, and is still dealing with it now. And I'm sure if there are folks on the line who are from the trade team in other places, they would tell you that fighting for Canada's survival on an economic and political level has become vastly more difficult over the past 30, 40 years. You just think about it. We're just on the top of North America. You've got an American potential election, which could put, forget about the wall down in Mexico. They would be creating a wall between Canada and the US, even though the US is our major trading partner. Canada used to be in what we call the Western European and Others group in the UN, but that's sort of dissolving as Australia and New Zealand are pretending that they're Asian. The Europeans are totally inward looking. The Americans are, an island to themselves. Where's Canada? Where are those bolsters that we need and have always needed as a middle power to leverage our interests? We've always leveraged our interests by going in and creating that that space, which brought others along. And I think the challenge for the next 10 years is going to be, how do we retain what we built? How do we do that if we don't show up? You know, NATO's 2%. How do we do that if we're serial joiners and never show up to the party?
I'm going to ask you a question just about the, you know, you're talking about Europe and losing the entry point through Britain, but has there been a bit of a shift in global affairs to try to make France as the entry point? Or is that, I mean, it's tougher. It's a whole different tradition and cultural issue, but we have the common
Well,
language.
I can't speak for their policy. I can only say that before I left, the interest of the government of Canada was to find all entryways into Europe. And some things are related to, you know, going to Rotterdam. Other things are going to Brussels. Other things are going to different parts. I mean, the one thing that, you know, some of us in government for many, many years have been pushing for a massive export of LNG. Why would we let the Americans go and garner the market when we have massive amounts of natural gas? We have like 300 years worth of natural gas off the coast of Newfoundland. Now, any normal visionary government would say, okay, we now have to point towards Europe, especially when we saw we should have been doing this before the Putin thing. We could see what was coming because we could see how, you know, under Merkel and those deals that they made with, you know, Nord Stream and the like, that all Putin had to do was just turn off the tap and the whole of Europe would be held hostage. And we kept saying to the Europeans, don't you realize you've got a real serious problem here? You think you're getting cheap gas now, which is like, these are like coke addicts, right? You know, the purveyors of drugs basically give you cheap packets of, you know, snort, and they get you addicted. And the next thing you know, the price has gone up, and basically they could turn it off, and unless you give them what they want. And this is exactly what we've been witnessing. One solution to that problem would have been using this huge amount of natural gas in Canada. But we have our own domestic issues. Our own domestic issues include not being able to get pipelines through various parts of the country, even though that's a federal capacity to put a pipeline through a province. The politics of that are crazy. Quebec is a hydro place. They don't care. They don't care to have pipelines coming through from the west, you know, with either natural gas from the west.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a block down there. What I do regret is that the vision that we will need to survive has been slow to non-existent because we haven't had the kind of leadership that we need. The Americans are now, bless them, way ahead of us on the liquid natural gas thing. And they are building the LNG plants and the export places that will just fill their vessels and send them to Rotterdam. And we don't.
So we have half an hour left, and we have a few questions in the chat that I'd like to get to. And so I'm going to kind of link them in here. Alan, let's talk a little bit. You're talking about future, Canada's future. What's your sense of the future of international law? Are you has your belief in international law wavered or strengthened over the years? Or does it
Well, it's not
continue?
a religion. So it's not really about a belief. It's about a commitment to a structure that we felt would work. If you're saying, like those guys said, well, history's come to an end, I don't think international law's come to an end. I've always had a view that if we implemented 50% of the treaties that we had signed on to, we'd have 100% better environment for the application of law. But as you all know, many folks, many countries have signed on to international instruments that they never actually ratify or adhere to. I think there's one thing is the implementation versus the creation of new international law would be great. On the other hand, you know, I am heartened when, you know, one of my major contributions over my career was the creation of the International Criminal Court, which was to say, okay, let's take the most heinous crimes and put them in that body. That was to stop the ad hoc creation of tribunals. Where I'm a little worried is that the original thought of those who are putting together the ICC has gone a little off the rails. I mean, partly because you've had a series of very, I don't know, creative would be polite thing to say, of the prosecutors that we've had. Luis Ocampo was a special character right at the beginning, with his own particular issues. We had Fatou Bensouda, who came from Gambia. You know, of course, this was the Attorney General of the Gambia during a dictatorship when people died, disappeared, were killed. We had this person running the office of the prosecutor. We now have Karim Khan, who was a massive compromise at a time when it was very difficult to vote for a new prosecutor, when really we wanted someone to come in and just run the office and run as a prosecutor. And he has indicated some very interesting approaches, including, I think, you'll look to countries which will say, you know, the bringing of indictments against Putin and other heads of government was never, ever something within his gift to do, especially if you didn't have, if they were not parties to the convention or the Rome Treaty, and also because it was way beyond what the parties wanted to do in order to keep a sense of order in the world. So, I mean, I'm watching the ICC now. I mean, I'm convinced the NGOs on the line just think this is fabulous. But I think if you're looking at it from a government point of view and trying to ensure a certain stability, then the concept of an international treaty has always been that only those who sign on to it are bound by it. And you've changed that rule.
So let me just generalize
that will
that.
worry a number that the US, so just to finish this thought, if you thought the US was bad under Trump vis-a-vis the ICC, if Trump gets back in, I mean, it's going to be a search and destroy mission, no question. What has happened, what we managed to do as Canada and some others, even under other administrations, Bush, for instance, and working with incredible people like John Bellinger and Harold Coe, who were legal advisors within the administration. We moved the US from a search and destroy mission to benign neglect to keen interest to use this court as a useful tool to bring justice in the world. And I worry that what's happening now could undermine that.
Alan, I'd like to just generalize that point a little bit because I think that's it's one of those challenging questions about what makes an efficacious treaty. And I think your example of the Rome Statute, how far you could go with it, who did sign on, who did, and who didn't, is a good example. So, what are your thoughts about that? Like, it's always that challenge between those who want the ambitious treaty that will do everything, whatever the field is, whether it's environmental, human rights. They want it to accomplish it all. And those who want a less ambitious treaty, but one that will get greater take up by
adherence.
Adherence, yes. What's your thought on how you work that out? Is it like you aim for the ambitious, but you put up with something less, or you never even think of the ambitious because it's pointless, because you're losing all the main players when you do that?
Well, so this is the simple answer. If everybody's unhappy but willing to sign on, that's the sweet spot. So you have just kind of condensed an immense process into just a very short thing. Treaties don't just happen. they are nurtured and grown, and there's like a seed planted. And anybody who knows multilateral instruments and how they develop, they start with an idea by someone, or someone's academics talking at a conference, or someone gets the ear of a minister, or maybe that then becomes discussions at the UN where there's maybe a little working group to see if a resolution may be useful, and then a resolution saying we don't like this particular thing, but maybe we should think about what we do with it. And then that turns into a working group, and then that turns into a drafting group, and then that turns into a commission that looks at maybe the modalities of putting a treaty together. And that can take another 10 years. I mean, people have come into foreign ministries and left them without treaties actually happening. Yet they've worked on that middle part. It's very rare you come in at the start and you're there for the middle and you're there for the end. Nobody lives that long. But the real key is, if you were to cut off the outlandish demands at the top and the naysayers at the bottom, and just deal with the middle ground, just like politics, usually politicians win in the middle ground, you eventually find that sweet spot. Now, the question is, which you've raised, is if you get a treaty which requires only like three countries to bring it into force, or even 20 countries to bring it into force, that's not much of a useful treaty. That's why when we look at the Rome Statute, and we have like 120 or whatever it is right now, and increasing, that's considered a success story. What you do need is negotiators with resilience, determination, vision, a bit of humor, and stick-to-itiveness, who build bridges year after year to get towards a common objective that eventually ends up where they are. And that's what makes it. When people talk about the kind of edifice of international law, and they just look at these treaties, what they don't see is the kind of synaptic connections, which is the human capital that went into the drafting of every little point. And when you see people at cocktail parties or dinners or coffee shops, they're not just there for the lousy coffee or the boring discussion of dinner. It's about sitting next to someone that you say, listen, I'm going to bring something to the floor tomorrow. I really need your help there. And by the way, could you bring some Africans and some Latins with you to do this? And if you do that, I think we can work a way to somehow giving you what you want. So that's what's happening at those cocktail parties. It's not just the drinking. The drinking is the lubrication, where you're not under the lights of a plenary. Nothing happens with the lights on. If anybody thinks that what they're watching in the UN is where the things are happening, it isn't. It's happening in the coffee shops, in the margins, in the restaurants around the building, on the key relationships with heads of delegation who are trying to put things together, on the back of a napkin, which is how I started with my Danish colleague in looking at a possibility of solving the Hans Island issue. And he says, well, maybe I can work with that. I said, well, if you can, I'll give you another drink. So I think I'm not going to knock the folks who work in the two-dimensional world, but I will say that more people are becoming aware of what goes on behind the curtain and under the table.
So there was one question in the chat from Brett Boudreau, didn't ask to be asked. And but he's somebody okay. Yes. I will read the entire question, but one of the points was about the urgent need for massive investments in diplomacy, public, cultural, etc. And I thought that was an interesting point, given what you're saying, and given the state of the world right now and the state of lack of peace, etc. That does seem to be an urgent need for investment in diplomacy. Do you have any comments on that?
I do. So the first thing I'll say is, this is a fabulous forum to talk, but it doesn't make up for the human contact. You can't cross a bridge you never built or you just blew up. That's what diplomacy is about. Diplomacy is about not having dinner constantly with people who agree with you, but really going out there and trying to sweet talk people who absolutely hate your guts and everything you stand for. That's diplomacy. There seems to be a lack of appetite for that amongst governments, and I think ours and others should be doing more of that. The other thing is, take a look at the Senate report that Peter Beam and Peter Harder put together. They actually took a look at global affairs and said what they thought should be done. Some of those things are being done by the department. Other things are not being done. But I do say that you will never overcome the human relationship in capital. That means actually putting people together in places. That means they actually have to fly there, or they may have to live there, or they may have to develop relations that take 20 years. Do you think that a new prime minister coming in to the PMO and who says, I want to speak to so-and-so has never met this guy because so-and-so is also new? It requires the relationships that have been built up by either the ambassadors in those two countries or the people on the ground to build that phone call. And those things about getting that phone call or having someone pick up the phone because you say it's the Prime Minister of Canada, that requires that you've actually built a relationship. Some prime ministers are good at that. Others are not. Other ministers of foreign affairs are good at that. Some are not. The real key is you have to ante up money. You have to ante up people. You actually have to demonstrate a commitment, and you have to show up. Then you can ask people to do things. Otherwise, they're just going to smile. We are riding on the coattails of the Second World War in terms of the institutions we're part of. We're part of the G7 because we were there at the beginning. We're part of the G20 because we were part of the G7. We're part of the OECD. We're part of all of these other things that that we've run out of steam on. We need to actually ante up more. So when someone embarrasses us by saying you haven't got your 2% of NATO, and when like a Trump says we're not going to look after these people because they haven't anteed up, we need to figure out, what do we do? What do we do? So Brett's absolutely right. We need huge investment in that relationship building. Relationships are tough to measure. They're not like barrels of oil and bales of wheat. Canada can say, oh, well, we've got all this oil and all this wheat. But the human relationship capital that allows you to get into those markets, that allows you to sign those deals, that allows you to sell those things, that's about people to people.
So I'm going to ask you a difficult question about diplomacy.
So the others weren't?
No, this one I think is kind of difficult because it did not end that well. That is the Canadian mission in Afghanistan, which you'll recall was this idea of defense, development, and diplomacy. It was a three-part approach that Canada was taking. And of course, we were not leading the entire mission in Afghanistan, but we all know how it has ended. So can you make any comment about that, connecting it again to diplomacy? Like how, there's a limit, presumably, of what diplomacy can do. I guess. I don't know. I don't know how to, to help you with this question.
Well, there's so many.
Maybe explain a little bit about what it was intended, and then we can talk about how it's not the diplomacy that failed. It was everything that failed, right?
Well, it was the biggest failure of Western diplomacy, I'd say, in the 21st century. But it also sent a signal that was very disturbing. So you remember that the reason we were there, the reason Canada was there, came out of the massive terrorist attack by Al-Qaeda on the Twin Towers and a bunch of other, the Pentagon and a number of other key areas by Al-Qaeda, a terrorist group that essentially invaded the United States, killed over 3,000 people in one shot, of which 24 Canadians died in the Twin Towers. So on the basis of you've killed Canadians, you terrorist, murderous death cult, we're going to join the United States in Operation Enduring Freedom, together with a coalition of others who wanted to put an end to this death cult and threat to Western civilization, as we indicated. This was Al-Qaeda that was hiding out in Afghanistan, was hosted by Afghanistan, by the Taliban, who were a merciless structure to begin with. So what happened was that we did join, and we bombed the living daylights out of this terrorist group, where they hid in the mountains and the tunnels and the other stuff of Afghanistan. And by the way, we then occupied Afghanistan. We effected regime change in Afghanistan. We put in place, literally, the governments that we thought would bring the kind of Western democratic, social democratic values where women and girls weren't treated like chattel. And when we bombed those villages, we didn't send them notes or email them and say, by the way, we're coming. We just bombed the living daylights out of them, destroyed everything. And then we stayed there for 10 years. Canada stayed for 10 years with the promise, in quotes, feminist foreign policy, which was the promise we gave young Afghan women and men was that this is a different world and we'll support you. The failure of that was that we didn't. We lost 158 Canadians, mainly CAF. We had many wounded, including members of Global Affairs who were wounded. Thinking of Bushra now, who lost limbs and body parts and who survived, but others who died. And when we look at what happened, we would say that's a failure because we have left those folks, those women who expected us to stand by them. Now, I know the argument, which is the argument that even Kamala Harris is using, if the Afghans didn't want to fight for themselves, why should we have stayed? But the real question is, what happened to our commitment to them? I'm reminded of that very situation when I think of what the death cult Hamas did last year, which was a terrorist group attacking a foreign country, which was an ally. In that case, 8 Canadians were murdered. And I'm thinking, did we join a coalition to go after that one, which is just as problematic in terms of what that means for Western civilization? I would say, and just riff off this, is that the 2 key international incidents that are going on right now, the 2 existential ones, are Ukraine winning against Russia to ensure that they go back into their box, and that Israel manages to deal with Hamas and the Iranian proxies. Because don't assume that this is just Hamas. This is Iran. And we see Iran in our negotiations with them over 752, what their interests are. We see what they're doing in terms of supplying the Houthis and Hezbollah and others. And so I kind of wonder where we have gone in terms of our awareness of what could happen. And I go back to Sudetenland and Hitler and what we should have done at that time. So I'm hoping, within the international law realm, and this is not going to be solved by international law, although I think international law should deal with it, is that we've got a serious decision to make. Instead of drip feeding these various situations with arms, we have to beat these folks before we are having Canadians die, either in Europe at the behest of the Iranians or in other places. So it's kind of a negative to go on, but put this way, there's a lot of room for international law to work.
Well, that's my last question to you then, really, is do you harbor a vision of a just international legal order?
of a just international legal order. I mean, yeah. So remember that the order that we negotiated is a negotiated order. It's based on our vision of what is justice. It's based on our vision of what universal norms are. If we want to survive, because the Chinese are telling us we're just merely a blip in their 500 years of Chinese culture and norms, and that we will go away, as do some of the Iranian, Persian vision of the world, saying that we will go away. If we want to retain what we have established, particularly in the 20th and 21st century, we're going to have to be willing to not only fight for it in a kind of a kinetic way, but we're going to have to figure out how do we win in these international institutions. How come we're losing votes in international institutions? Some of these revisionist countries who are telling us, don't worry your pretty head about women, don't worry, we only signed on to your international agreements because you forced us to do that, and now we're going back to our cultural heritage of what we are and don't tell us what to do. If we accept that, we will succumb. And I don't think my generation would want to do that. And I would hope that the next generation doesn't, that they're willing to actually fight for these norms that people died for. And I worry about that they're not.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, very interesting. One other question about has the global affairs legal department changed over the course of your career? And do you have any thoughts on the direction of the legal advisor role in the global affairs team moving forward? That's from Sean Stevenson. Yes, Sean.
Well, I mean, first of all, I'd take a look at what the Senate committee suggested, which was to have a very, very robust legal team with a very senior legal advisor. So when I left, it was an ADM position. The current restructuring has taken apart the legal branch and bifurcated it into a trade bureau led by a director general and a international law bureau led by a director general who's now given the title of legal advisor. Whether that is a good structure, time will tell. My sense is that you need to have someone who has the heft and the willingness to hold a mirror up to the public service as well as ministers, and who says, I'm here as your lawyer and I'm going to tell you what you need to hear, whether you make a decision or not. Loyal advice and the expression was untempered advice and loyal implementation. And I hope that that is what's going to come. I trust that will come because that's been our history to date. And maybe sometime in the future, that structure will reemerge. At the moment, it has changed in global affairs.
I have a question from Dr. Boris Babin that I'd like to put to you. It's asking about Russia. Thank you for your comments about Russian aggression in Ukraine. But he goes on, the suggestion that, in 2014, some academicians started to propose banning Russia's participation in the UN, especially regarding the fact that Russia de jure didn't enter the UN when USSR collapsed. Such position was also declared by Ukraine in the UN when Russia's broad-scale aggression happened in 2022. What's your opinion on this issue?
Well, there's no way you don't want to have Russia as part of this. I mean, no one's suggesting you don't want to talk to Russia. What we're suggesting is you need to talk to Russia, but they need to be listening, and you have to be careful about how many things you exclude them from before they say, screw you. The one thing that all of us regret, I think, and because this is yet again another Sudetenland thing, is that when Russia occupied Crimea, we did not do what we needed to do, which was to severely, severely penalize Russia. And that then allowed for what ensued, because, l'appétit arrive en mangeant, and that means appetite increases with eating. And Putin does, he stated this, he does want peace. He wants a piece of Crimea, he wants a piece of Ukraine, he wants a piece of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. He wants a piece of Poland. He wants a piece. So he does want peace. The question is that the spelling of peace we're going to give him? And are we strong enough to stand up for that? I don't know. I have a serious doubt that, with the weirdness that's going on in Western democracies, that, we'll be fighting over the crumbs instead of looking at what's coming over the horizon. The Chinese know exactly what they want, and they have a shipbuilding process that can build ships in weeks and months. We're sitting here allegedly defending our Arctic, and we've got the Louis Saint Laurent that is at least 10 years after its use by date, and I've been on that vessel, believe me. So I would ask our politicians when they come around in the next election that's going to happen soon is, what are you doing? How are you defending our interests? And we need to get out of our internal parochial views of the world in North America, because we will be dragged into it in any event. Just read history. The Americans tried to stay out of the Second World War, and they did. The Americans have a marvelous history of coming late to these adventures and then claiming victory. So, they came late to the First World War. Yeah, they happened to help out in the end. They came after, at the end of 41, and we were there since 39. If they'd come earlier, we wouldn't have been there. But it's this hesitancy to deal with those problems. And we're seeing that again now. The major plank of these political parties in the States is to say, we don't have Americans in danger. Well, of course they have Americans in danger, and they don't want them to be in danger. But if they aren't in danger, we're gonna lose. And I see we've got 3 minutes left.
We've got 3 minutes left. And we have one more question. I'm so sorry I didn't get to it sooner, but it was a comment about Indigenous peoples, the rights of Indigenous peoples. And you had mentioned how they had been so helpful. The perspectives and interests of Indigenous people had been very helpful in the negotiations that you were involved in. Do you have any other comments about the increasing role of Indigenous peoples in in international fora?
Well, I think, as you've seen, that there is actually a forum in the United Nations, the Indigenous Forum. I spent many years in Geneva at the Working Group on Indigenous Populations, which eventually turned into a much more cohesive and internationalist expression. If you look at the Arctic Council, it is a super unique environment, unknown anywhere in the world, where you have an international organization that has equal participants from the states and Indigenous, and it has worked tremendously well. This was created in Ottawa. It's still working very well. And in terms of Indigenous in Canada, we have one of the most advanced relationships with Indigenous, and an ever-growing understanding and relationship with Indigenous. The experience that I had on the international boundary was about we could never have had an agreement if it wasn't for the Indigenous components wanting to shore up their families and their history by creating a boundary of certainty, but a porous boundary that allowed them to join. So, I look forward to other expressions of that. And that I'm not in this world anymore, but I'm sure that the domestic departments and global affairs have that in mind as they move forward.
Yeah, no, that's a great example and an important development. So, Alan, we have come to the end of our time, and I thank you for your stamina, as well as your wonderful comments throughout the last 2 hours. So, on behalf of everyone who's on this on this webinar. I'd just like to thank you so much for being an excellent speaker and providing so much useful information about the day-to-day life of working in global affairs and career advice. You were very helpful in that regard. So thanks, Alan, and thank you to the audience for joining us. Thank you for your attention and for the excellent questions that you posed. They really help stimulate the discussion. So please follow both the International Law Association and of Canada and ILA Global on our respective websites and social media for the next events. You're most welcome to join the exciting and supportive international law community of ILA Canada. And please note that we provide free membership to students. So with that, I wish everyone a wonderful evening. Je vous souhaite une très bonne soirée. Merci beaucoup pour votre attention. Merci beaucoup encore à Alan. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.